He killed over 200 people. Yet he never raised his voice, never flinched, never felt a thing. But here's the truth no one talks about. Hitmen aren't born monsters. They're made. And what if the same process that creates them is quietly shaping us too? If you're still here, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm this story matters. It always starts quietly. A man in a cheap leather jacket sits in a car outside a suburban house. Inside, a lamp glows faintly through the curtains. He checks his watch. 11:47 p.m. He isn't nervous. He isn't angry. He isn't anything. The man's name is Richard Kuklinski, better known later as the Iceman. To neighbors, he was a polite husband, a father who played with his kids, and a guy who kept his lawn trimmed. To others, the ones who paid him in envelopes of cash, he was a ghost. A professional killer who claimed to have murdered more than 100 people without a flicker of emotion. When investigators finally caught him in 1986, what chilled them wasn't the number of deaths. It was the calm, the complete absence of anything resembling guilt or empathy. During interviews, Kuklinski spoke about murder the way someone might describe making coffee. Sometimes, he said, I didn't even look at their faces. It was business. They were there, then they weren't. And that's where this story begins, not with a gunshot, but with a question. How does a human being reach that point? How does someone silence every natural instinct? Fear, compassion, hesitation, and replace it with ice. To understand that, you have to step inside the mind of a hitman. The making of a killer rarely starts with violence. It starts with desensitization, the gradual rewiring of emotion. Psychologists call it emotional flattening. It's the same process soldiers undergo in combat training, where they learn to override empathy to perform under pressure. But for contract killers, that process happens without rules, medals, or orders. It's purely internal, the construction of a moral void. For Kuklinski, that void was carved early. He grew up in a violent household, beaten by a father who taught him that weakness invited pain. By the time he was a teenager, empathy had become a liability, something that slowed you down. He learned to shut it off, brick by brick, until nothing was left but survival instinct. That's the first stage, trauma conditioning. It doesn't create a killer by itself, but it lays the foundation, teaching the brain to treat emotions as dangerous distractions. Every time a child learns that crying leads to punishment or that showing mercy brings pain, a neural pathway forms. Don't feel equals stay safe. Over time, that equation becomes second nature. The second stage is moral disengagement. Here's how it works. When we do something wrong, our brain creates dissonance, a conflict between action and conscience. But some people learn to silence that conflict by creating mental distance from their victims. They start to use language that dehumanizes target, problem, assignment, not person. This is how professional killers operate. Kuklinski once told a psychiatrist, "I didn't kill people, I just removed obstacles." That's moral disengagement in its purest form. It's the same mental loophole soldiers use in war, except a hitman builds it for personal profit. Once the human face disappears, the act becomes mechanical. And when morality fades, emotion follows. Would you survive being trained to feel nothing? Comment below what you think. Could you ever switch off empathy like this? Stage 3, emotional compartmentalization. The human mind can't handle constant contradiction. So killers build internal rooms, mental spaces that never touch. In one room, they're fathers, husbands, neighbors. In another, they're executioners. Each identity sealed off from the other. This is how Kuklinski could attend his daughter's birthday party hours after dismembering a man. He didn't see those actions as conflicting. They belonged to different compartments of the same psyche. Neuroscientists studying sociopathy have found that in such individuals, the amygdala, the brain's fear and empathy center, shows reduced activity. It doesn't mean they're born evil. It means their brains stop responding to moral stimuli. When normal people see suffering, their mirror neurons activate, they feel the pain vicariously. But in killers, those neurons go quiet. The connection breaks. And yet, paradoxically, many hitmen aren't emotionless all the time. They can love their families, laugh with friends, even feel nostalgia. But they learn to weaponize emotion, to control it like a switch. They decide when to turn it off. That's what makes them so terrifying. Their humanity isn't gone, it's under command. There's also something else, something psychologists call instrumental violence. Unlike impulsive killers, who act in rage or fear, hitmen kill for utility. Each death serves a function: payment, reputation, loyalty. That's why many contract killers score low on impulsivity but high on cognitive control. They plan meticulously. They study routines, lighting, timing. Their violence isn't chaos, it's choreography. Kuklinski once described how he would sit in his car for hours before a job, watching a man's movements. He said it wasn't excitement he felt, it was focus, clinical detachment. He didn't imagine the victim's family, didn't think about consequences. He thought about execution. Nothing else existed. Psychologically, that's known as flow-state disassociation. It's the same mechanism elite athletes use during performance, complete immersion that shuts down external thought. Except in this case, the performance is death. And the scariest part? The mind rewards it. Each successful hit reinforces the detachment. The killer's brain releases dopamine not for the act itself, but for control, for mastery over fear. That's why many assassins describe their first kill as difficult, their second as easier, and their 10th as routine. It's conditioning through repetition. Each act dulls the moral nerves a little more, until empathy becomes irrelevant. That's how it happens. Not overnight, but step by step: trauma, disengagement, compartmentalization, repetition. A psychological evolution that replaces emotion with function. And by the time the process is complete, the assassin doesn't feel empty. He feels efficient. Kuklinski put it this way: after a while, you don't think about what you're doing. You just think about doing it right. In Kuklinski's world, death was not chaos. It was control. He once said that killing gave him the same peace other people found in prayer. To most, that sounds monstrous, but in psychology it makes sense. Because the brain can be trained to associate power with pleasure and detachment with safety. And that's how empathy dies. Not in one moment, but through 1,000 small denials of humanity. When a hitman takes their first life, the body often goes into shock. The hands tremble. The vision blurs. The mind tries to reject what it just witnessed. But over time, repetition does something terrifying: it builds tolerance. Psychologists call it emotional desensitization, the same process soldiers experience in long wars or surgeons after countless losses. The brain learns to mute empathy as a form of self-defense. Each time the trigger is pulled, and nothing bad happens to them in return, no punishment, no remorse that breaks them, the subconscious learns that killing is safe, that it's even functional. In Kuklinski's case, he began rewarding himself after each kill. A drink, a drive, a night out, and soon, the act of taking life became just another part of his schedule. To understand this transformation, you have to understand one thing. Most hitmen don't start out evil. They start out numb. Many come from homes soaked in violence, where love and fear wear the same face. As children, they learn early that empathy is dangerous. If you cry, you're weak. If you feel, you're hurt. So they build walls, invisible ones, that block emotion before it even forms. And by the time they become adults, those walls are concrete. This is why psychologists like Dr. Michael Stone, who studied criminal minds for decades, argue that professional killers are often not born sociopaths. They are trained dissociators, people who've learned to step out of themselves when it's time to act. And once that dissociation becomes automatic, once the brain can switch between normal life and execution mode like flipping a light, the person becomes unstoppable. Richard Kuklinski described it like this: when I had to kill someone, I became someone else. It was like closing a door inside me. When the job was done, I opened it again and went home. That's not insanity, that's conditioning. In a study by forensic psychologist Dr. Kathleen Heidi, most contract killers scored higher in emotional compartmentalization than in sadism. Meaning they didn't enjoy the pain. They simply didn't register it. To them, it wasn't murder. It was maintenance. There's another layer, one far darker. The process doesn't just suppress empathy. It rewires the brain's reward system. Every act of killing releases adrenaline, dopamine, and endorphins, the same chemicals tied to thrill and euphoria. For most people, this combination comes from running a race or winning a game. But for a hitman, it's from playing God. Over time, the body becomes addicted to that chemical surge. So when they're not killing, they feel restless, irritated, incomplete. The same way an addict craves a fix. And that's why many assassins, even after retiring, admit to having dreams, not of regret, but of nostalgia. Because nothing ever made them feel so alive as watching someone else die. This isn't fiction. When neuroscientists scanned the brains of violent offenders, they discovered that the amygdala, the region controlling fear and empathy, was significantly less active. And the prefrontal cortex, which regulates impulse control, showed abnormal responses. It's not that killers can't feel. It's that their emotional systems have been deliberately silenced through repetition and trauma, like turning down the volume until there's nothing but static. But here's the most disturbing truth of all. Some of the world's most effective assassins never pull a trigger. They operate from control rooms, offices, or even remote screens, authorizing deaths through decisions, not weapons. And just like the hitmen, they, too, become desensitized by distance. The more abstract death becomes, the easier it is to order. This is what psychologists now call moral disengagement, when people mentally justify harm because the act feels necessary or distant. It's the same psychological armor that lets a drone pilot press a button from thousands of miles away. And the same armor a mob hitman wears when he looks into a target's eyes and feels nothing. At first, it was one man pulling a trigger. Then it became an army. Then a system. The transformation of killers into emotionless machines didn't stop with the Richard Kuklinskis of the world. Governments studied them. Militaries modeled them. Corporations learned from them. Because in a world built on obedience and efficiency, emotion is friction. And nothing runs smoother than a human being who has learned to turn off his soul. In 1944, psychologist B.F. Skinner proposed something revolutionary, that behavior could be engineered. Reward what you want. Punish what you don't. Repeat it enough times, and you can make anyone do almost anything. It sounded harmless in a lab, but in the hands of power, it became doctrine. The military learned this lesson fast. During World War II, studies revealed that only 15 to 20% of American soldiers actually fired their weapons in combat, even when under attack. Not because they were cowards, but because killing another human being triggered an instinctive resistance. So the U.S. Army changed its methods. They stopped training soldiers to aim at enemies. Instead, they trained them to hit targets. They used human-shaped silhouettes instead of bullseyes. They added sound effects, rewarded every hit, and slowly the kill became just another conditioned reflex. By Vietnam, over 90% of soldiers were firing their weapons. They'd succeeded in doing what Richard Kuklinski did to himself on a national scale. The scary part? That same conditioning leaked into civilian life. Video games, mass media, and movies, all designed to desensitize the modern mind to violence. By 18, the average American teen has witnessed over 200,000 acts of violence on screen. We don't even flinch anymore. Death became entertainment. And when empathy becomes entertainment, humanity becomes optional. There's an unsettling symmetry between the brain of a contract killer and the system that trains soldiers, guards, and even employees in high-pressure industries. Both rely on compartmentalization. Both reward suppression. Both glorify obedience. You don't question the order. You just perform the task. In psychology, this is called cognitive dissonance reduction, the mind's way of protecting itself from guilt. If the act conflicts with your morals, you rewrite the story until it feels right. I'm just doing my job. They deserved it. It's for the greater good. And that's how the modern world manufactures numbness. In hospitals, in offices, in governments. We're all trained to function, not to feel. But there's a catch. Because even the coldest mind can't kill conscience forever. In Kuklinski's final years, he confessed something that few ever caught. When asked if he ever regretted his life, he said quietly, "Sometimes I wonder what I could have been if I didn't have to be him." That's the fracture point. Even the most desensitized killer still carries the ghost of who they were before they learned not to care. And sometimes that ghost screams. Today, psychologists studying moral injury, the trauma caused by doing things that violate one's values, have discovered that many killers, soldiers, and even drone operators experience delayed empathy. Years later, in dreams or flashbacks, they start to feel everything they buried. All at once, the walls they built crack open, and what comes out isn't rage. It's remorse. That's why so many ex-hitmen spiral into depression, alcoholism, or suicide, because you can silence empathy, but you can't kill it. It waits. But here's the haunting modern twist. The more technology evolves, the less empathy we need to function. AI can pull the trigger. Drones can identify faces. Algorithms can assign targets. And no one ever has to see the body. The perfect hitman is no longer a person. It's a system. A digital machine that kills with mathematical precision and zero emotion. The desensitization that once required years of trauma now comes pre-installed. So, if the 20th century was about training men to feel nothing, the 21st century is about teaching machines to do it better. And that brings us to a terrifying question. When the system no longer needs empathy to function, what happens to those of us who still have it? Somewhere, buried under layers of obedience and technology, there's still a human heart, beating, watching, remembering, and maybe that's the one thing they can't fully erase. This is not just a story about killers. It's a story about how the world teaches us to stop feeling. Don't forget to subscribe for more psychological true crime content. Also do well to watch the next video. It questions what you already think is true, and you will find its conclusion scary. Stay curious, but stay human.